This morning we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 13 and Mark chapter 4. So if you want to get your Bibles and open them to those two passages, if you want to open to Matthew 13, that's where we're going to spend most of our time this morning. I must tell you in advance that as I prepared this lesson and I finished up putting my thoughts on paper, as I went to bed every night this week, I finished it last Sunday. And as I went to bed every night this week, I said, okay, before I go to sleep, I'm going to run through the lesson in my mind. And I never made it past about 10 minutes. So I hope that you can last longer than 10 minutes this morning as we go through this together. In Matthew chapter 13 takes place in a time in Jesus' ministry that is, his ministry is gaining popularity. And people are following him by the multitudes. And because of that, he also is changing his style of teaching. Matthew chapter 13, and as well as in Mark chapter 4 and in Luke chapter 8, we have the scene played out that's depicted for us here. But start with me, if you will, and look at verse 1 of chapter 13. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and large crowds gathered to him. So he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. And he spake to them many things in parables. And we'll stop right there. Jesus introduces a new style of teaching that his disciples had not heard him use before. And that is the use of parables. And what I would like to do this morning is look at three parables from this scene in Matthew chapter 13 and also depicted in Mark chapter 4 and pull some life lessons from that. Jesus tells those that are closest to him at this time that he's using the parables to bring about and to illustrate some of the things that heretofore the multitudes were not able to grasp. He says, those of you who are closest to me, the apostles, what became the apostles, you understand some of these things, but the mysteries of the kingdom has not been revealed to others. And so I'm going to use parables to help them understand that. And he actually quotes from Isaiah in verses 10 through 17 about the fulfillment of prophecy and how that parables would be used to do that. This morning I want to look at the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9, and then the explanation that Jesus gives to that parable in verses 18 through 23. And then I want to look at the parable of the tares in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, and that's the only place where this parable is recorded. And then another similar parable in Mark chapter 4, and it's only recorded in Mark chapter 4, but all three of these parables depict the scene of the life cycle of a crop. Imagine that, farmer talking about growing grain. But even though the scenes are all the same, the applications of those parables are unique. And what I would like to explore with you this morning, some of the life lessons that we can gain from looking at these three parables as a whole. Each of these three parables contain three distinct but similar parts. They describe the life cycle of a grain crop. They talk about sowing. They talk about the maturity of the crop, and they talk about the harvest. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the aspect of sowing. As you can see from the picture here, and when you look at the Greek word for sowing, it's a term that is used that means to scatter. In all three of these parables, that is the first thing that you see, that the farmer went out to sow. And what that means is that he took his hand and he scattered the seed in the ground, on the ground that he had prepared. And I think that's important for us to understand the difference between sowing and planting. You plant a garden, You take and you put seed in a specific spot. And as you can see in the picture there, you plant a plant. But sowing is this indiscriminate covering of the ground. And with a grain crop like wheat or barley or oats, the intent is to cover the ground completely with the plants. Because when the ground is covered with the plants, it shades out the weeds, it keeps the moisture, and so therefore the intent of the farmer is to cover the ground completely. And to give you just an example, when you plant wheat today, with the tool that I use to plant wheat, I plant a row of wheat 7.5 inches apart, and there's a continuous string of seed along that 7.5 inches. You'll plant almost 1.5 million seed to the acre. But when you plant corn 30 inches apart and 6 inches apart, and you put about 26,000 corn seed to the acre. So you can see there's a vast difference in the population of the seed, and I think that's important and for you to keep that in mind as we look at these three parables. Then the second phase is that each crop matures, and we'll look at the individual scenes of that in these three parables, and then each crop is harvested. The harvesting represents the payday for the farmer. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 13, back to verse 3 now as we look at the parable of the sower. And he spake many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell by the road, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell in the rocky places where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. Others fell on the good soil, and yielded a crop, some 100, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Back in this era, and even still today in some of the Middle Eastern countries, they did not have fields like we see around here that consisted of 30 or 40 or 60 or 200 acres. Their fields were very small, and their fields were divided sometimes by rock fences. In the book of Deuteronomy, there's prohibitions about moving the rocks that marked the landmarks of your neighbor's field. And so as a result of that, it was not uncommon for the farmers to have to walk out to their fields. And as you can see, and as the parable points out here, some of the seed that he planted fell on that hard ground, and it couldn't take root. And even though it sprouted because it couldn't take root, it eventually died. But Jesus gives his own summary of this parable in verses 18 through 23. So look over there, if you will, with me. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes. Verse 19, when anyone comes the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom the seed was sown on the road. The one whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, but it's only temporary. And the affliction and the persecution arises because of the word. Immediately he falls away. But the one on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom the seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100, some 60, and some 30. We've heard many, many sermons on this parable. It's probably one of the most recognizable parables that Jesus offered. And Jesus gives his own explanation of the scenes that's talked about in this parable. And it's not I'm incapable of improving upon this, but the intent that Jesus, I think, wants us to see and wanted the people to see at this time is that don't worry about the result. Do your job and sow. Do your job in sharing the word with others. The next parable that I'd like for you to look at takes place still in Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 24. This is the only place this parable is recorded. And I think for us, it should have some very sobering thoughts and sobering messages for us. Follow along with me, if you will, beginning in verse 24. Jesus presented to them another parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven must be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. And while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. And bore again. Then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did we not sow good seed in your field? Then how does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' And he said, 'No. For while you are gathering them, the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them again. Allow them both to grow, and until that time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first, gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" I can tell you that tares are a wheat farmer's worst nightmare. Tares are essentially a mutant form of ryegrass, and it's still battled today. And if a farmer plants wheat on the same ground year after year after year after year, wheat production will eventually become unproductive. Only in the last 20 or so years have herbicides been developed to effectively deal with this. And still today, the most effective way to deal with it is crop rotation. And evidently this was true in AD 30. If you look at the picture that I have up for you, the one on the right is the mature wheat head, or not the mature wheat head, but the wheat head after it emerges, and those little things that you see hanging off of it are the bloom. To the left are the tares and what they look like. We live basically in the same latitude as this region of Samaria. So wheat is planted in the fall. And we plant typically sometime in November-ish, late October. And the wheat comes up, and then when it turns cold in December, late December, January, the wheat just kind of sits there. And then in the March, April time frame, it begins to tiller. It begins the stem begins to come up, and you start seeing the flag leaf, which houses the head of the wheat. And it's in that time when you see the tares. You don't see them until they sprout up. And here they are, you've got this wheat and you're so proud of it, and then all of a sudden you start seeing the tares come up. This is the same situation that Jesus is depicting here. And so the wheat is established, it's ready to produce its head, and here are the tares, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except wait until it's time to harvest. And just as the farmer admits in verse 29, he said, "No, for while you're gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them." Now, if you'll look over to verse 36, Jesus explains the parable. Beginning in verse 36, "Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples said to him, explain to us the parable of the tares. And he said, the one who sows this good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with the fire, so it shall be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the fire, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. One of the beauties of farming is that you know when you plant a seed, it's going to produce what the seed is. You don't have to worry about planting corn and watermelons coming up. This message is very sobering for us because it says that the children of lawlessness are of the devil. They're reproducing exactly what has been sown. What's also sobering about this parable is it says that these tares look just like the wheat until the time that they produce their seed. I think there's some very stern warnings here that we need to be aware of. And that at the harvest time, the tares will be separated from the wheat, and they will be thrown into the lake of fire. Hell is a prepared place for a lawless people. And there's numerous warnings throughout the New Testament that challenge us and should give us warnings about how false prophets will operate and men of lawlessness will operate. In 2 Peter chapter 2, he says, "But false prophets will rise from among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who brought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of truth will be maligned." Jesus, in his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 23, says, "Beware of false prophets who come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from bushes, nor figs from thistles. So every good tree bears good fruit, and every bad tree bears bad fruit. Every tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits." And then an even sterner warning, not everyone, in verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I will declare to them, 'Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" Jesus uses the term lawlessness in the parable of the tares, and he also uses the term lawlessness here to describe people who may look just like us. People who follow the will of God and do some wonderful things, but in that day, what did they produce? Jesus tells us that the definition of lawlessness is one who does not do the will of his Father. Are we guilty of holding things back that we don't want to do because we just don't want to do them? Are we holding things back from fully serving our God because it's just contradictory to our will? That's the definition of lawlessness. What are we producing? The next parable I'd like for us to look at is over in Mark chapter 4. So if you want to turn there, and this is the only place this parable is mentioned. Your Bible may call it the parable of the seed. Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 26, and he was saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who casts seed upon the soil. And he goes to bed at night and gets up, and the seed sprouts and grows. How? He himself does not know. The soil produces crops by itself. First the blade, then the head, then the mature grain in the head. But when the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. Again, we see this depiction of the farmer casting his seed on the soil. And then, as he goes to bed and as the days progress, he sees that seed sprout. And he sees the result of the sprout. He sees the leaves start to appear. And as the seed is sprouting, the energy that's within that seed to produce enough energy for the leaves to appear above the ground and the roots to start going down into the soil so that the plant can sustain itself. How does this happen? He does not know. There's something very exciting about planting a crop for me. And there's this sense of anticipation. There's this sense of how does this all take place? You prepare the ground. You take this dead seed that's hard and dry, and you put it in the ground, and then something magical happens. Keep in mind the imagery that's talked about in all three parables of this seed being scattered throughout the field. But one of the things that I find interesting about this parable is in verse 28. He says, when the soil produces the crop by itself, first the blade, verse 29, but when the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. You may have seen pictures of the wheat harvest where you have multiple combines in the field harvesting the crop. And there's a reason for that. Because when the grain matures, the plant is dead. The stalk that's holding the head up, that has the grain on it, is dead. It's brittle. It can be blown over. And so when the wheat matures, there's basically about a 2-week window that the farmer has to get this out and to get it to the store. And to me, that's a very exciting time. Last year, with the help of James Jensen and Joshua Jones, I don't know if there's any significance about JJ's, but they helped me harvest about 1,700 acres of grain. And you see the anticipation of the farmer because that's his payday. He's waited a year for this. And so inevitably they will come out after about the first hour or two and say, how's it doing? What's it going to produce? How's the yield? But there's something significant about this that I think is important that this parable speaks to, and that is the preparation for the harvest and being prepared. And if we look at this in the context of all three parables, we see that as God's people, when the opportunity exists for us to share the word, we need to be ready. We need to be ready to act. We need to be ready just as the harvest is ready to get the crop out. There's a sense of urgency that should occur. And Jesus is using this comparison to indicate the sense of urgency in sharing the gospel with others. I can assure you that if the people that heard this message were grain farmers and heard these three parables, the message was very clear to them that Jesus was getting across. And so, as he says in the outset of Matthew chapter 13, he's using this to help them understand things that they didn't see and to help them to hear a message that they might not understand. So with that introduction, I'd like to share with you 4 things that I think that resonate with me that come out of these 3 parables. First of all, in each of these 3 scenes that we see, each farmer was prepared. They had planned. They had prepared the soil. They had procured the seed. They were watching the weather, if you could watch the weather in AD 30. They were ready to move when the time was right. There's a common joke among farmers that says, how do you have $1 million at the end of the year? Start with 2. Farmers are some of the most optimistic people I know. You're not going to be ambivalent if you're a farmer. You're going to be hopeful. You're going to be anticipating. You're going to be looking forward to what lies ahead. And this was the case in each one of these scenarios that we see presented here. Each of us should be planning for the next phase of our life. And I realize that there's a fine line between obsessing and planning, but we should be planning for what lies ahead. Some of us, this is graduation time. Some of us are graduating from high school. Some of us are planning for the next year of college. Some of us had graduated from college. Maybe you're a couple and you're planning for your first or your second or your third or your 4th child. Maybe you're getting older and you say, how are we going to take care of ourselves? Or how are we going to take care of aging parents? These things we should be preparing ourselves for. But we should have a certain optimism about the future. Because the future is not when we breathe our last, but the future is when we see God face to face. This should give us hope. This should give us optimism. If we are downtrodden, it's not because of what lies beyond this life. It's because of what we're experiencing in this life. And there's something better. There's something better that lies ahead for each of us. And so we need to be prepared. We need to plan. We need to take care of the next phase of our life. In each one of these 3 scenarios, things happened that were outside of the influence and the control of the farmer. Each crop that we see and each scene that we see presented in these 3 parables. In the parable in Matthew chapter 3, verses 4 through 8, we see that the birds came and the thorns grew up. In the parable of the tares in Matthew 13 and verse 25, we see that the enemy came in at night. And in Mark chapter 4, in verse 28, he says, how this happens, he does not know. Each of us have had things happen in our life, both good and bad, that we have absolutely no control over. Sickness, death, loss of jobs, unfaithfulness, mistrust, slander are all things that some of us have endured. But we have endured them. Sometimes tough times come as a consequence of our own actions. But many times it's the result of others. But the source, just as in the parable of the tares, is the evil one. And we're seeing the fruits of the evil one in our lives. Conversely, each of us have experienced wonderful things in our life that we cannot explain and we had no control over. All of us live in a society and a time in this world's history that no other society has been so blessed. We are the benefactors of being born into that time, and we had no control over it. Our paths have intersected with people that upon accurate reflection, we had no control that our paths would intersect, and we've been the benefactors of God's providence. We have a Savior, and we have a way to live with our God forever in a plan that we had absolutely no control over, but we are the benefactors of it. And as he says in Mark 4:28, how it happened, we do not know. But thank God that it did. The third lesson that I hope we can take away from this is patience. Each farmer had to wait until the harvest time was ready. We need to be patient with each other. We need to be patient with our children. We need to be patient with those who are young in the faith. And then finally, each farmer was prepared for the harvest. For a harvest to be gained, the crop has to die. And so far, with the exception of two, life is 100% fatal. We're all going to cross that river. But just as the harvest, just as the reward is received with the harvest, our reward will be at the harvest. When we have the opportunity to see God face to face and to sing to Him, holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, that will be our reward. Thank you very much for listening. I've gone a bit too long, so we're going to have a closing prayer. Joshua Jones is going to lead it.